Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 24 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. And Gavin, my heart is a little bit more full tonight.
Oh, and why is that, Mike?
Well, even though we're not recording in the same place like we may have teased um, last week, you are in New York State, you are in the Eastern time zone, and you
I
just being that
am,
much closer to me, it's a good feeling.
but I really, I gotta tell you, it was real nice recording at about 8:30 my time in the Mountain Time Zone instead of 10:30. Um, Literally for like the last 2 hours, I was like, I feel like I should be doing something right now, but I just wasn't.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at right now. If you hear a yawn, a stifled yawn, that's why.
Man, and here's the problem. I didn't even consider that until just now when you told me.
Yeah.
I suppose we're gonna have to adjust our recording schedule, but one way or another, I'm sure we can figure it out.
Well, yeah, we'll figure something out.
Well, either way, we can get through this episode. And now that you're back in New York, it's going to be a kind of a New York themed episode, which I'm really looking forward to. But before we get there, we of course have to look up this week in science, and let's see if I can go 2 for 2 with
Mm-hmm.
guessing the year for this week in
Yeah.
science. So I'm going to say that this one a little older than last week. I'll say it's a 2017 for this week.
Not quite. You
Uh,
didn't go. You didn't go far enough.
okay.
2012.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely would.
Yep.
Some of the more recent ones have actually gone back a little further than the ones at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. So, all right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna make a note of that.
So this one is from May 27th. So tomorrow, at the if you're listening to this on the day it goes out. But yeah, so May 27th, 2012. The headline is Mass Extinction Recovery Took 10 Million Years,
Hmm.
which
Yeah,
immediately raises many questions for me because,
like which mass extinction?
exactly which one? And then are you meaning that to say that that's a long time or not that long of a time?
I mean, just that headline doesn't sound like they're making a value judgment one way or the other. They're just stating like it took this long.
Well, let's find out.
Let's do it.
So, geoscientists from the University of Bristol, which is in the UK, published the results of a study claiming that Earth's greatest mass extinction event sidelined the planet for almost 10 million years while life struggled to recover. So, Mike, quick quiz for you. Do you remember which one, if they're saying it's the worst, which one is that?
Oh, I'm not gonna remember the name.
Do you remember roughly when it was?
I believe this was before the dinosaurs.
That is correct.
Yeah,
That's a pretty low bar since that's the most recent one.
yeah,
But
right. So that was 65 million. Was that was that somewhere in like the 200, maybe 230 million year range?
250.
Okay, so that was
Yep.
close.
Yep. So this event, thought to occur some 250 million years ago, was brought about by ocean acidification, global warming, acid rain, and ocean anoxia, which is the absence of oxygen in the oceans, and left alive only around 10% of total plant and animal life. Experts came to this conclusion through analysis of rock sections taken from China and other global sites. They added that several more global crises occurred following the main event, further hampering the planet's recovery attempts. So,
I
I
mean, it
feel
sounds like
like,
to me that they're like just saying it took 10 million years to recover, and they're not saying that it's long or short. That was the sense I got.
yeah, but also from the couple of classes that I've taken about mass extinctions,
Right?
2012, we kind of still didn't understand how they worked yet.
Really?
Not that we still currently do fully, but it's like so that one, which is the end Permian mass extinction, um, which, as I've mentioned previously on this podcast before, we lovingly refer to as the Great Dying, because it is absolutely correct when it says about 90% or I should say, the way they phrased it is that it left only around 10% of animals left alive.
Mhm.
Plants is a really plants are a really weird thing to quantify extinctions for. just because, frankly, it's kind of hard to figure out what a plant species is.
Why is that? Why, like, what makes? I mean, I'm gonna ask a question that would sound dumb out of context, but
Hmm.
what makes a
Yeah.
plant different than an animal?
So plants, I will say this is leading into territory that I kind of don't want to go, just because, frankly, it is a very philosophical question about what even
Okay.
is a species.
Okay, maybe we can bracket that for another episode.
Right, and it's like that is one of the biggest questions to people who work in taxonomy, giving names to things, where it's like, okay, what is a species? It's one of those things where it's like you know it when you see it, but you don't know how to define it, right?
Right. Right.
And so no one has a good definition of species that actually encompasses the full amount of diversity and variability that nature has.
Right.
Most
This is the old Supreme Court definition of porn, right? Like, I know it when I see it, but it's hard to write a hard and fast rule. Like,
Sure, I'm not familiar with that particular
oh,
Supreme Court decision,
oh,
but
I am. I forget which justice said it, but you keep talking.
but yeah, so with plants, so animals do hybridize more than some people think. Like I actually personally learned like less than a month ago that domestic cattle, you know, regular cows can hybridize and produce viable offspring with bison.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that, which is weird to me because they're not even all that closely related. They're in the same subfamily for sure. I don't. They might be in the same tribe, but I don't know. But relative to some other things, they're definitely not in the same genus, and yet
Right.
they can produce viable offspring. Whereas lions and tigers, which are in the same genus, different species, but they're in the same genus, can reproduce to make ligers, but ligers are not viable. Same thing with horses and
Right.
donkeys. They're in the same genus, but mules are not fertile. So again, what one of the things of the most commonly used like definition of species is called the biological species concept,
Mm-hmm.
which basically does not account for hybridization whatsoever and also doesn't account for fossils. So I personally don't use it, too much when paleontologists in general don't use it.
Is
We
it
we have
useless or just not like what you guys use?
it's the way that I've sort of been taught it in grad school is that it's all education is, especially as you get higher, is a systematic refutation of lies. So that's
Mm-hmm.
just that's like the first lie that you tell people when in freshman biology, where it's like, okay, we need to if we're going to talk about species, we need to have some kind of working definition of what a species is.
Right.
But as you get higher and higher in your education, you kind of learn, okay, the thing that I was taught in freshman bio was only like kind of right. um
Mm-hmm. It would,
but anyways, circling back to how this is relevant to plants hybridize with things that are very far apart. Like on a tree of life, they can hybridize with things that are much farther apart than animals can, and produce viable offspring. So it's like, okay, how do you rectify that with you know like extinctions? How do we know really that this plant species isn't just some weird hybrid that technically might be some you know other species that we already know about and not a new species? You know what I mean?
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
with plants, it's very hard to tell, and a lot of times we don't have good plant fossils in general to begin with. A lot of times it's based off of like pollen that you can find. Like fossil pollen is used all the time.
Fossil pollen?
Yes, it is a huge part of paleontology these days.
All right, another new episode because I don't know if we have time to get into that, but
No,
I,
we don't.
I want to know more about it.
But anyway, I have a lot of statements about this mass extinctions little article here. However, this is going to be a rather whirlwind episode, so I want to get into it.
And if we're going with whirlwind episodes, I will just quickly put a button on what I said before. It was Justice Potter Stewart in Jacob v. Ohio who famously said, "I know it when I see it," when discussing whether something was or is not pornography.
Interesting.
Speaking of knowing it when we see it, New York State is what we're going to be talking about here today, and so it looks like we're going to be going Correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like we're doing kind of a straight up geology of New York State episode today.
Absolutely. We're going to be talking a bit about the fossils too, but just sort of in honor of me coming back to New York for at least the short term foreseeable future. I thought we'd talk about a bit about the geology of New York State because, frankly, in terms of like really, really cool geology, most people think that you kind of have to go out west for it. Um, People think of all the national parks and things. Where I lived in South Dakota was not that far from Badlands National Park, which has amazing, beautiful geology. Um, and people sort of think of places like that or big mountains like the Rockies. But New York has some really incredible geology as well as some really, really important geology that so many people just don't really know about. Um,
Now, let me ask you this question, and like I'm pretty, I think we discussed this very early on. This might have been our first episode, and I'm sure I could give a rather poor definition.
mhm.
But we're saying the geology of New York State. What's just
Yeah.
the bare bones definition, like difference between geography versus geology of New York State?
So I guess for the definition that I'm using today is just sort of like the long-term history of New York State is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to
Okay,
be talking about some of the rocks, how they got there, why they are sort of the way that they are.
perfect. So let's get right into it. Geology of New York State. Is that what we're going to start with? We're going to start with the rocks.
Yeah, 100%. So we're going to start sort of with the oldest stuff and then do a little bit of geography, where things are located along with it. Because obviously, geology is not the same all across the state. Um,
Now, podcasts are obviously an audio medium, but if
they
you
are.
are, yeah, if you're at home and not driving and you have the opportunity to pull up just a map of New York State, just like a Google map or something, it's, I assume, going to be helpful as we're talking about this because, New York State's not Rhode Island here. There's a lot going
It is. I can confirm that New York State is not Rhode Island.
on.
But also, if you cannot, another helpful way that I've sort of used before, just because I've met many people that are not from New York in the last handful of years, and who are not familiar with New York geology. So or geography, where things are in New York State. So what I do is I say, hold out your right hand in front of you with your thumb out, and then all four of your fingers together. So all the way at the end of your thumb, that is over toward Buffalo, New York. Syracuse is somewhere sort of just below your knuckle on your middle finger or so. And then New York City and Long Island are sort of down at the bottom right corner of your hand, sort of where that little bone sticks out in your wrist.
And Canada is your fingertips.
Canada is your fingertips, absolutely.
Hmm.
Um,
Never
so
heard that
that
before, and that's a good one. I like that.
Yeah, so that's if you
Gets the
can't
job
pull
done.
it. Yeah, if you can't pull a map, this gets the job done. So we're going to go from, and as we do in geology, from the old stuff to the new stuff. So the oldest rocks in New York State are about 1.3 billion with a B years old. That's pretty old. Most people think, to get super old rocks, you got to go out to the Rockies, or most people don't even think about, how old the rocks underneath their feet are. But in certain parts of New York State, over a billion, well, comfortably over a billion years old. Um, and if you can remember some things, I'm going to be referencing our 600 million years in 2 episodes quite a bit. So if you can remember some of that knowledge, that would be helpful. But if not, don't worry about it. So this 1.3 billion years ago is from the Proterozoic Eon and from the Mesoproterozoic era. So sort of the middle part of the Proterozoic Eon. And these rocks were initially deposited during a time where there was a lot of really shallow oceans in the world. So these are pretty shallow ocean rocks. And back around a billion years or so, there was really not much swimming around in the oceans other than single celled bacteria and things like that. So we don't really have too many fossils from this time. So that's some of the old rocks, but they don't necessarily stay sort of how they were when they were deposited because a lot of things happen in almost a billion and a half years, including a really important event called the Grenville orogeny. So an orogeny is a mountain building event. Things like, two continents, crashing into each other, causing a lot of mountains to grow. So the Grenville orogeny happened around 1 billion years ago. So quite a bit after those rocks were initially deposited, about 300 million years afterward. And the Grenville orogeny creates a supercontinent, not the one that most people are familiar with. So not Pangaea. This is a different supercontinent called Rodinia. And when Rodinia is formed uh, during the Grenville orogeny, it creates these gigantic, gigantic mountains. Like, at minimum, Himalaya-sized mountains.
And
Huge, huge, huge mountains.
when that happens, how does that change the rocks itself? Because I'm thinking about this as, okay, we are changing, the layering of the rocks, and they're being
Mm-hmm.
stacked and smushed together, but like the composition of the rocks are not being changed. Is that correct, or is that am I wrong in with that picture in my head?
You are not necessarily wrong, but more often than not, yes, the rocks themselves are changed.
Okay, how does that work? Because that's fascinating to me that the actual composition of the rocks changes during these mountain building events.
So, are you familiar with the three different kinds of rocks?
I am. I was tutoring some kids in their earth science homework not too long ago, and we were
Okay.
learning about metamorphic, sedimentary, and igneous rocks. And
A-
I know metamorphic is the ones that change because of heat and pressure and lava and stuff.
Absolutely. Not lava.
Magma.
Nope, neither.
Okay.
So, you're absolutely right that those
I
are
don't
the
know what
three
grades those
different.
kids got on their exams, but
So,
it wasn't that specific. So
right.
don't fire me
So,
yet.
uh, metamorphic rocks are formed when you put rocks under a lot of pressure and a lot of heat, but not enough heat to melt them.
Okay.
Um, then, if they melt, then they become igneous rocks. And there's a weird bit of overlap sometimes because metamorphic rocks having pressure helps, but they don't necessarily need a lot of pressure. So, for example, if there's a big like magma chamber underground, sort of the walls of the chamber can be metamorphosed just by the heat from the magma.
Hmm.
So without any sort of mountain building events or continents crashing into each other to cause that extra pressure, they can be metamorphosed that way.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so in general, there are there are actually many, many types of minerals that only form under these really high pressure situations when continents crash into each other or when they're buried very, very deep. Because the way continents work is that they're very thin and relative to the rest of the planet, um, and the sort of Earth underneath them is plastic, meaning that it's sort of liquidy. So think of it as sort of like two sponges on top of some water, right? So when you crash them into each other, if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, eventually one's going to end up on top of the other.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, and knowing how metamorphic rock, under heat and pressure, and of
Mm-hmm.
course, when continents are moving together, they're going to create that pressure
Mm-hmm.
needed to eventually, on the time scales that we're talking about,
Right. Yeah.
to actually change the composition of the. That makes so much sense.
Because so each mineral, so in things like the shales and things that were probably in these layers before the continents crashed into each other, shale is mostly made out of quartz. However, there's always sort of little impurities just sort of along with it. There might be just like 0.5% of some other element that was just happened to be in the water that got deposited along with the quartz of the shale. So each mineral has a set, very specific chemical composition. For quartz, it is silicon dioxide, so one silicon atom and two oxygens. However, under those different heat and pressure scenarios, some of those other elements that are just kind of naturally along with it and in the rock can sort of you can form new minerals out of the different elements that you have there because under those heat and pressures, um, they can sort of form atomic bonds that way. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm not a chemist. There's a reason that I study sedimentary rocks and not igneous metamorphic rocks. So that is essentially how I understand it. Uh, but yeah, there are lots of minerals that are only formed during, um, metamorphic events like this, including most of the rocks of the Adirondack Mountains, which we're going to talk about for quite a bit here. Um, but yeah, so right now we're about 1 billion years ago. Uh, Lots of continents crashing into each other, big mountains forming. Rodinia, this supercontinent before Pangea, was around for quite a while. So Pangea was only like fully together for definitely less than like 50 million years. Like definitely less than that. I'd say closer to 20.
Hmm.
But Rodinia is more or less together for like 400 million years.
So why is Pangea more famous? Is it just because it was more recent?
It's more recent, and because of that, we have way more information about it.
Okay.
And also, there were things living on land at that point.
Yeah, fair enough. All right.
Whereas during this time, there wasn't even really multicellular things kicking around in the oceans yet.
Really? How long ago is this again?
This was roughly 1 billion years is when it sort of
Okay.
formed. And
Yeah,
then
okay.
by the time that it ended, we were just getting the first things that we would recognize as animals. Yeah, so Rodinia, like I said, around for about 400 million years. And during that time, those gigantic mountains that were formed during the Granville orogeny were eroded basically flat, just because 400 million years of time will do that. So eroded basically flat, and then Rodinia sort of split up, similar to how Pangea did, and formed what we call the Iapetus Ocean. It's essentially where the Atlantic sort of is today, but because it closed again before the Atlantic formed, it's not the Atlantic Ocean. It's a weird technicality, but trust me. A little bit after that, so now we're currently at about 550 or so million years ago. Some volcanic islands formed in the Iapetus Ocean, similar to like Hawaii, except a lot larger. And naturally, as things do, given hundreds of millions of years of time, that large volcanic, it's called a terrain, also smacked into what is today the east coast of North America. So not as big of like a collision, but it did also form some mountains as well. That one is called the Taconic orogeny, and also formed more mountains. Surprise.
So this is how New York has gotten some mountains, even though, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not like super close to a fault line.
Yes, that's true. That's
Okay.
right.
Actually, quick side
Oh,
note, like,
yeah.
is my understanding correct? Like, in general, you're going to get most mountains, like around fault lines, because that's where the tectonic plates are going to be pushing up against each other. Not every fault line, but that's where it's more likely to happen.
So there are different kinds of like faults and things. Like a fault is literally just any time that rocks shift underground with
Hmm.
some like displacement. So if you look at the Adirondacks, if you look at like a geologic map of the Adirondacks, you can find faults all over the place.
So let me rephrase that. Tectonic plate boundaries.
Okay. Um, in general, yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Um, there are
Big in
certain
general
things,
on all that.
right? Like
Okay.
obviously, like the Rocky Mountains. The Rockies are one of the largest mountain chains in the world. Not really near a plate boundary.
Hmm.
The closest one would be on the
San
west
Andreas.
coast of,
Yeah.
yeah, the west coast of North America, where the North American plate meets the Pacific plate. Um, and that's how they're formed, is because when ocean crust is generally more dense than continental crust. So when a continental plate meets an ocean plate, the ocean plate will sink because it's more dense. And then as it sinks, it gets hotter and hotter as it sinks, because the heat comes from the center of the planet, and it'll melt sort of like the leading edge of the continent, or of that plate. And when it melts, it gets warmer and then rises, causing the continental crust above it to rise up. And that's the Rockies.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That this is just cool, man.
Yeah, once you get to things like this scale, like solids act much more like liquids than they do solids.
Over this long a time span, like nothing is solid over hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but yeah, so if you remember, uh, back to that 600 million years in 2 episodes, um, there were two smaller subcontinents or supercontinents that made Pangea, one called Gondwana in the south and one called Laurasia up in the north. And the tectonic orogeny um, helped form Laurasia out of North America and Eurasia, Europe and Asia today. And then when those fully formed Laurasia, that's called the Akkadian orogeny. So lots and lots of continents just smacking into each other as
Hmm.
they do given these timescales. Um, we don't have a ton of rocks to show for that last one because they all eroded, but we can find them making other rocks.
Hmm.
So,
Wait. Hmm. Go on.
so the rock cycle, basically, all of these plates crashing into each other make big mountains of metamorphic rocks, right?
Right.
When those mountains erode, they form sedimentary rocks. So while we don't have any rocks really from this Akkadian orogeny, the one that formed the northern supercontinent, Laurasia, we don't have any rocks directly from that mountain building event, but we have rocks that they eroded into.
And we can tell that. We can tell. Oh yeah, this used to be an igneous or a metamorphic rock, and now it's a sediment. Like we know that.
I mean, given global context and finding context clues on other continents, yeah.
We can infer that very strong. Wow. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So now we get into some time periods that are people might be a little more familiar with. So we get into the first Phanerozoic rocks, which are the Phanerozoic is the current eon that we are in when we start seeing complex life. So this is from the Cambrian period, and it's called the Potsdam Sandstone. I've been to Potsdam; it's a pretty cool place.
I don't think I have.
No,
I mean, I maybe at one point, but nothing stuck out.
so before I
Cool name.
talk a little bit about the Potsdam, um, I'll give a little bit of reference because I think I meant to talk about this earlier and then did not. But so if you're holding out your hand again, all of the evidence for what I just talked about, that roughly almost a billion years worth of time, is on the right hand side of your hand, sort of in the area of roughly the like middle knuckle of your ring finger and your pinky finger, roughly in those areas. Those are the Adirondack Mountains.
And by the way, this is with your right hand, like your
Yes,
palm facing outward, not towards you.
correct. So that is the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. Some of my friends from South Dakota and other places around the Midwest kind of would make fun of me because they're like, "Those aren't mountains. God, what's the highest peak? Only like 4,000 and some change." Like, no, it's like 4,500. Get it right. Um, as
I
opposed to
mean,
some of the peaks in the Rocky Mountains that are like 14,000. So in the grand scheme of things, they're not that tall of mountains, but they used to be. They used to be like Mount Everest sized mountains there.
and so how does that happen that they get smaller?
Erosion
Okay.
over hundreds
Over.
and hundreds of millions of years.
So then why is Everest still so tall? Is it
Because
like
Everest
newer?
is currently being built. Everest is going to get taller.
Son of a. All right.
Well, because it's from
I'm jealous.
India. It's from the Indian subcontinent crashing into Asia.
Okay, so this is where my ninth grade earth science is
Hmm.
more accurate, where these tectonic plates crash into each other and still being built. Wow. Okay.
Hmm.
I'm jealous.
Uh, but yeah, so all of that, all the information and all the evidence that we have, at least within New York State, we have lots of evidence from basically the entire East Coast, is really, really marred up. And if you look at a geologic map ever, you'll see lots and lots of bright colors all swirled together. All of those are bands of metamorphic rocks because, you know, when you crash a bunch of continents together, they don't tend to stay in neat lines like sedimentary rocks like to be. They get all sort of wavy and curly. And so you can see that basically going all the way up and down the East Coast because a lot of that left over is in the Appalachian Mountains, which the Adirondacks are technically a part of.
I didn't know that. I thought they
Yep.
were separate things. Huh, cool.
Nope. But yeah, so that's the Adirondacks. Sort of forming a ring around the Adirondack Mountains is the Potsdam Sandstone. So we have evidence for all of those events happening, but all the rocks that we have in the Adirondacks are still really old. There's almost 1 billion years of time between the Potsdam Sandstone and the rocks that are immediately beneath it in the Adirondacks, which is super cool. I think there's about 800 million years of time that has been eroded away between those rocks.
Wow. So that's
Mm-hmm.
like a yeah. I mean the paleontologist version of a like time machine.
Pretty much, yeah. But the Potsdam itself is also a really cool formation, just because you can see these big sort of. It's like a conglomerate sort of at the bottom of it, so bigger, not actually sand, but things you could actually just sort of fit one or two of in your hand instead of grains of sand toward the
Mm-hmm.
bottom, and then it gets more toward like a normal sand toward the top. Um, and the Potsdam's extremely widespread outside of New York State. Weirdly, in New York, you can only find it sort of just around the Adirondacks, but you can find, uh, correlated units pretty much all over the place on like the northern side of the United States. You can find lots of it in like southern Canada as well, all the way out to like Indiana, Michigan, Ohio. And I think I actually read somewhere in doing some of the research for this episode that technically there's a correlated unit in like Wyoming that
What?
correlates to the Potsdam Sandstone.
There's nothing
That
correlated with Wyoming and New York.
you with geology and a couple 100 million years of time.
Wow.
That one I think is I'm a little skeptical of that one.
Mm-hmm.
But that's supposedly what it said. So anyway, the Potsdam's also really cool because it's the first time that we see real fossils in New York, and some really important ones too. Like normally you don't think of sort of like conglomerate sized rock formations, big grains. Those typically don't tend to preserve fossils super well, but in some areas, the Potsdam Sandstone has fossils from jellyfish,
How,
which is just
eh,
crazy.
yeah, right. Explain to me how. I mean, maybe this is a time for another episode, but
Yeah,
jellyfish. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like no bones.
they have not just no bones. They don't even have any form of hard parts. So that can definitely be for another time. Um, but yeah, jellyfish
Jellyfish can't get hard.
fossils.
Apparently, they
Oh,
can get hard. Actually,
Mike.
I guess they can because they get to be fossils.
Moving on. Yeah, so that was the first Phanerozoic, the first relatively recent rock formation that we have in New York State. And then after that, things get kind of interesting because, like I said, that sort of forms like a bit of a ring around the Adirondacks. Other than the Adirondacks, New York State's geology is actually incredibly simple because if you start in the north and work your way all the way south down to the Pennsylvania border, you start with old stuff and then you get to newer stuff.
Hmm.
So
That's convenient.
it's very convenient, and it is an excellent way to teach one of the, like, pun intended, bedrock principles of geology called the principle of original horizontality, which is a lot of
Principle.
words to just say.
Can you say it one more time?
The principle of original horizontality.
Ooh, I think I actually might know what this is. Go ahead.
All right, hit me.
It's so basically all else being equal, when rock is first laid down, it's going to be perfectly horizontal. And so if you see rock that has that is shifted in one way or another. It's diagonal. It's got some sort of a cut through it or a fault or whatever. Like something has happened after that rock has been laid down, and you need to figure out what it was because there was some geologic event that did that to the rock.
Absolutely, that's correct.
Yes.
Um, so there are a few, as we've talked about, even in this episode, sort of a little bit of a systematic refutation of lies, in that there can be very slight slopes to them, so it's not perfectly horizontal, but that is pretty much the gist. Um, so, but for people who might not sort of understand, this is how I have thought while I was writing the script. Actually, I've never actually used this before as an analogy. So let me know if it works. So think
Oh
about
boy.
like a table.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a table where the top is a rectangle, and you orient it sort of north and south. You make the southern legs just a little bit shorter than the legs on the northern side. So it's got a
Uh-huh.
bit of a slope.
Right.
So then you put the table underwater. Okay. If you drain the water, the parts in the north are going to break through the top of the water first, right?
You mean like the part of the table is going to break through the water first?
Right, because it's on a slant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. 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 Right.
So that's basically how New York is.
Hmm.
So,
I mean, go further with this, but I think I understand what you're saying.
so think of the surface of the water as the surface of the land, and the surface of the table being a rock layer.
Right.
So once the water surface hits the northern side of the table, because it's upslope from the rest of it still continues down through the water, which in this analogy is the earth. Do you see what I mean?
I think so. Yeah, because it's the everything is slanted, and so that first layer is only going to cover the the lowest most part of New York State, and then the next layer is going to cover he's going to cover all that plus a little bit more, and then it can it should keep going up from there. Do I have kind of that right idea?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
So in this analogy, we sort of start up north with some older stuff, and because it's slanted, it gets younger as you move south. So we start off up in the north around where I live, sort of around the Thousand Islands region, all the way down to just a little bit north of Syracuse. So if we're looking back at our hand analogy, so your right hand's out in front of you, from the tips of your fingers down to about halfway between the first knuckle, so your actual, I guess, your bottom knuckle on your pointer finger, to your middle knuckle, about halfway between there. That is pretty much all uh, Ordovician age rocks. So the Ordovician period is after the Cambrian period, and it lasted from about 485 to 443 million years ago. And generally, it's a lot of limestones, some shales, and some sands and things as you get more towards Syracuse. But as you stay up in the north, it's mostly limestones. You can find lots of really neat fossils in there, especially around like the Watertown area.
Mm-hmm.
You can find lots of neat fossils of some early clams and snails and things like that. No vertebrates really yet. They were around, but not at all prevalent. But you can definitely find some neat fossils and things. As you get around Syracuse, which sort of in the hand analogy is about sort of where your the little basically where your pointer finger and your middle finger sort of meet in your hand. That's roughly where Syracuse is.
Mm-hmm.
In that area, you have a really thin band that runs from east to west of Silurian age rocks, which, if you remember back to our 600 million years and two episodes, uh, you remember that the Silurian period is the shortest geologic period that we have, and I pretty much was like, hey, the Silurian exists, not much happens, moving on. but the Silurian lasted only about 25 million years, from 443 to 419 million years ago.
Hmm.
And a large amount of Silurian fossils come from New York,
Hmm.
just because it's relatively short. So therefore, there's just not a lot of rock from this time. And New York is an extremely well studied area. There's been, scientists here for hundreds of years.
So there's a bias towards New York State, but New York is also good for that time period.
Yes, very good. And Mike, do you happen to know sort of Syracuse's nickname as a city?
Uh, I'm gonna go with the Salt City.
You are correct.
Okay.
And all of Syracuse's salt comes from this time period.
Really? And again, how long ago is this?
About 443 to 419 million years.
Wow. So from that long ago, that's still lasts long enough to where it can be dropped as a nickname on a
Mm-hmm.
city. Huh.
Yep. During this time, there were a lot of, this was a big beach. And so there was a lot of evaporation going on. And it left a lot of, sea salt left over from when, the water got evaporated.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty cool. Uh,
Right.
so along with, things like gypsum and other evaporite minerals as well, is what those kind of minerals are called. And so that band, like I said, is very, very thin. It only sort of runs along I-90, going east to west. And it's really only a couple miles thick total, all of these Silurian age rocks. And then basically from Syracuse all the way south to the Pennsylvania border is Devonian aged rocks from 419 to 358 million years. That's pretty much it. That's all
Mm-hmm.
Devonian rocks. Um, Including one of my personal favorite and one of, in my opinion, the coolest stories of any like fossil locality called Beecher's Trilobite beds.
Beecher's Trilobite. I mean, that's a great name.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with what a trilobite is?
I feel like I am, but I not well enough to even take a stab at describing it.
Okay. I would say other than dinosaurs, they're probably the most commonly like used fossil organisms in like imagery. Even if you didn't know what it was, I guarantee you, to anybody, I guarantee you, you've seen a trilobite, even if you didn't know that's what it was called. Um, but they look similar to like beetles almost. Um, but they were around for a very, very long time. They were around from basically the middle of the Cambrian, probably around 520 or so million years ago, all the way until the Great Dying at 250 million years ago. So they were around for almost 300 million years. They were around for a hugely long amount of time. Um, and New York also happens to be one of the best locations in the world to find them. Um, So the story of this sort of locality was that this guy who I believe at the time was working for Yale was just kind of doing some stuff in New York State and came across this really thin, only a couple centimeters thick layer where they had excellent preservation of these trilobites. And he worked on it, published I think like 3 papers about them, about their preservation, because obviously with fossils it can be really hard to learn things about their anatomy because you might not have the whole thing. But these were preserved so well that he could talk about a little bit about their reproduction, a little bit about
Wow.
sort of their ventral, so like their front side, or I guess the side that would be um, toward the ground, in a normal organism, not humans because we're weird and we stand upright. But so like
Hmm.
on your cat, it'd be like their belly, essentially. Talk about their anatomy on that side because, frankly, most of the fossils that they had found at that point were not good enough. We would only get their backs. We wouldn't really get sort of their belly side. Um, and then about 2 years after he published some of these stuff, he died. And back then, this was the early 1900s, I believe. He died in 1904. they were not great about keeping records of things,
Hmm.
and he never told anyone or took anyone else there. So this locality was just completely lost to science until I think 1984. So for like 80 years, no one knew where this locality was.
Hmm.
And until some guy found it. I think I actually literally just some random guy. Um,
Some
let's see.
dude.
Yeah, so it was discovered in 1892 originally, and then sort of excavated and published on by this guy named Beecher, who the locality is named after, and it was lost up until, yes, 1984, and then because Yale sort of had like the original claim to it, it is on private land nowadays, but Yale still is able to go in and publish things on it. And they found a couple other layers nearby that show the same kind of really incredible preservation. And I'm lucky enough to have been able to be one of the few like non Yale people to have actually been to this site.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
Are you allowed to
And
say how that happened?
I mean, I just went with my advisor. I went to do some collecting for, um, so one of my advisor at Cortland, one of his other students that he was advising, was doing her undergraduate research on trilobites, and he was like, "Hey, do you want to come spend, a Saturday collecting trilobites with us?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. I got nothing going on." Um, So I've been there, and it's super cool. I think that was one of the first times that I'd actually been out like fossil collecting for like science, not just for like a class or for myself. So that was super super cool to me. Um, and I don't know, one of my favorite fossil localities, and there are many with similar stories to that. Maybe not quite as weird, but just being completely lost for 80 years. Um, but all over New York State, over toward Buffalo in those in a lot of the rocks over there, we have some of the best eurypterids, also called sea scorpions, in the world. They're not uncommon everywhere else, but they're like exceptional here in New York State.
Right.
Um, but so as I sort of mentioned, we've talked about the Adirondacks, we've talked about basically everything between Canada and Pennsylvania. You might be thinking, okay, so the Devonian period ended about 358 million years ago.
That was my thought.
What about the rest of time? Where is it?
That was something that had like crossed my mind. Like, how recently can rocks be made? Like, can rocks be made yesterday?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay. I assume that's igneous rock
Yes
mostly.
and no. So a lot of it, if you look on a map, you might like a geologic map. You'll probably see a lot of like beige colored stuff, referred to as quaternary alluvium, which is basically just river deposits, and quaternary is sort of our current, geologic time. So it's
Hmm.
not yet rock. It's literally just stuff that was kind of dumped there by a river. So it's
Okay.
just unlithified sediments, um, but still, worthy enough of putting on a geologic map. So, um, but yeah, so between the Devonian period and Quaternary alluvium, there's really not much. You might get an occasional igneous sill or some kind of like igneous intrusion. Those kind of things do happen in seemingly random places from time to time. Um, and there are some around New York State, but in terms of sedimentary rocks, there's really none. So without quickly taking your eyes off of our Google Doc, why do you think that is?
Why do I say that one more time?
Why do you think there is that really long gap between the Devonian period and now, where we don't find any rocks in New York State?
So, would it be the fact, like, if we're going with that table analogy, like the table just, ran out of room in New York State and that table just continued down through Pennsylvania and Maryland and the states that come next?
So
You can say no. You can say no, not even close.
right, but I'm trying to think of a way to fix that part of the analogy. So basically, the top of the table represents a single rock layer, right?
Right.
So if that particular rock layer happens to represent the Devonian period rocks. What about the stuff that should be above it? The more recent stuff.
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, I see. Okay, yep, yeah, yeah, yep. So I got the metaphor wrong there.
Okay.
So here's the thing. I looked at the doc earlier, and I think I know what comes next, but I'm trying to think of what I would have said had I not looked
Okay.
at the doc earlier. I
Mm.
probably would have just said like, was there just no rocks made between sometimes rocks get made and rocks don't get made, and like rocks just don't get made between now and then.
That's definitely part of it.
Okay.
If you're in the middle of a continent, for example, there's really not a ton of rocks being deposited in, even not that far from the ocean in like, Western Pennsylvania. There's not a ton of rocks being deposited right there.
Good old Pennsylvania.
Well, I mean, there's just not a lot of deposition because land tends to be where you erode from, and oceans tend to be where you deposit the stuff that got eroded.
Right.
So sometimes in certain places there just isn't, deposition. However, based on some of the rocks in Western Pennsylvania, since I'm already talking about it, that's where a lot of like Pennsylvania's coal comes from. Same with because it's sort of in the same general geologic area of like most of West Virginia's coal. Um, that is land based stuff and isn't terribly far from New York. Why aren't those rocks in New York? And I mean, they might have been, but over the last handful of thousand of years, we had a whole lot of ice here in New York State, and most people who live in New York are pretty used to winter. If they're from Syracuse, they will tell you about it.
Oh, we won't shut up about it.
No, you won't. And I mean, trust me, I do that all the time too. So I'm also making fun of myself here, but
Hmm.
the winters in upstate New York are very cold and very snowy. Um, However, during the Ice Age, 20,000 or so years ago, there was about a mile of ice covering almost all of the state.
And Jim Boeheim was still on top coaching the team.
Sure.
Do you know who Jim Boeheim is?
Oh, of course I know who Jim Boeheim is. Who
Okay.
do you think I am?
I just wanted to make sure.
But yeah, so glaciers are one of the most effective erosional tools that we've discovered on the planet. So if you've got a literal, this is not an exaggeration, a literal mile of ice above you, that's a lot of weight just scraping rock right off of the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it covered all of the state except for one little sliver, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these glaciers eroded away any rock more recent than the Devonian that might have been there and basically turned it all into Long Island. So before the last glacial maximum, which was, I think, around 20,000 years or so ago, Long Island did not exist. That's why Long Island is literally all sand.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
I
Because
did not know that.
Yep, that is just where the edge of the glacier sat for a few thousand years and just dumped all of its sediment that it's been, dragging all the way from up in like Canada, and then just scraping all of that sediment along, basically making gigantic sandpaper that it scraped New York State's surface with and dumped all of the leftovers as Long Island.
Wow. Okay.
Um, but that talks about most of the rocks of New York State, but not some of the most really, really cool glacial features of New York State. Which, in my opinion, some of the coolest glacial features anywhere in the world are the Finger Lakes.
I was going to. I had always heard that, but it had
Mm-hmm.
been from like people I don't trust at this point. But yes, okay. The Finger Lakes came from glaciers.
They did. So pretty much all of New York's lakes came from glaciers, including the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes were formed by glaciers.
Yep. Cool.
But the Finger Lakes are super cool. So if we have the hand analogy back out, so if you have your right hand palm away from you out in front of you, the Finger Lakes are roughly from like, let's say like the first knuckle of your pointer finger, and then sort of to the left a bit, maybe a little more like sort of south than that,
Yeah, I was gonna say probably a little further south.
um, but there's, despite how it sounds, there are more than five of them. Um, but basically, when glaciers run through, they make these really big, wide U-shaped valleys on like a river valley, which is much steeper and more like V-shaped. Um, so the glaciers didn't just sort of come and go; they, you know, extended and retreated several times. So each time going to a different, maximum extent, each sort of pulse of glaciers. And so each time they just completely change the landscape relative to what it was before. But they sort of leave remnants. And that's sort of what the Finger Lakes are, is that after not the most recent, but the one before that glacial pulse, they carved out these valleys. And then because glaciers, melt, they create a lot of runoff and create rivers sort of as they're retreating back north. And the rivers usually fill in the valleys that the glaciers themselves occupied.
That seems to
And
make sense. Gravity, you know.
yeah, and so uh, the Finger Lakes all were originally rivers, and but as rivers do, they're not as effective at eroding as glaciers are, but they're still pretty good at it.
Hmm.
So each of the Finger Lakes used to be a river that was fed by glacial outwash, but at some point the glacier sort of stopped at about the northern extent of each of the lakes, melted and filled them with water, and then as it retreated sort of blocked it off, because they all of those rivers that used to be the Finger Lakes flowed north into Lake Ontario instead of south.
Right.
So the glacier stopped, dumped a bunch of sediment, blocked off each of the lakes, and then went back north. And so
That's why
oh,
they're lakes, not rivers.
exactly. And a lot of the valleys that you see in central New York, such as the one where my undergraduate alma mater, SUNY Cortland, is, the valley that Cortland, New York is a Finger Lake that never got blocked off. So there used to be a big lake there while there was ice there, but it all got drained because that particular valley did not get blocked off like the rest of them did.
It's like getting a B on your homework. You did almost everything right, but you just kind of left that one thing unattended to.
Yeah. And that's also a big part of why the Finger Lakes are particularly deep, for given how sort of narrow they are. So the rivers that filled them originally had sort of already sort of started some of the erosion, and that just sort of fast tracked the like downward erosion while the glaciers, were at their maximum and covering those spots. So it was just eroding extra. So like some of the larger Finger Lakes are hundreds and hundreds of feet deep, because of the fact that they were rivers originally, and that's kind of how we know that.
Hmm.
So New York's glacial geology is, like I said, some of the coolest in the world, and if you're at all interested, do some research into it, because it really is super neat. Um, but like I said, there was one area in all of New York State that was not covered by glaciers, and weirdly, it is like this little corner that is now a state park, about an hour south of Buffalo, New York. So in this situation, it is down toward the hand scenario, down toward like the very bottom of your thumb. Probably at the bottom of your thumbnail, essentially. So it's about an hour south of Buffalo, and it's called Allegheny State Park. And for some reason, the glaciers just completely avoided that spot.
Did it go all around that spot, or like did it just for some reason, not go there and anywhere else, west and south of that?
So it went. It didn't go south of it, but it was both north, east, and west of it.
Hmm. Yeah.
So is it as if this area just sort of split it down the middle, as if there was like a big mountain there or something, which to our knowledge there's not, or at least was not at the time. It is on a plateau, but it's definitely not taller than like the Adirondack Mountains. So we're not really sure why that area avoided the glaciers when the Adirondack Mountains didn't divert them really at all.
Hmm.
And so my initial thought when I first learned about that a few years ago was, okay, is there how old are the rocks in that area if they didn't get destroyed by the glaciers? And
I,
unfortunately,
I yeah. How
it's
there's no
it's
glaciers there? They should be recent. We should have rocks from yesterday.
unfortunately, while there is some really neat geology there, it is all still Devonian aged rocks.
What the? So you lied to me with the whole glacier thing. That's not why there's no new rocks. What is this?
Well, glaciers are not the only thing that erode rocks. Number one,
Well, okay. Why is it that in Allegheny State Park there's nothing newer than um, Devonian?
that's an excellent question, and to my knowledge, we don't know
Wow, that's a
because
mystery.
most of the rocks in that area, outside of the area that was not sort of saved from the glaciers, it is relatively flat. There's not a ton of rock sticking out of the ground. So, but within the boundaries of the park, there are lots and lots of rocks sticking out of the ground. Um, and like there's a one particular area of the park 'cause it's quite a large park. Um, there's an area called the Rock City because there's boulders just sticking out of the ground that are like the size of buildings and areas just completely naturally, conveniently about as wide as a street in between them for you to walk through. And they're also sort of referred to as Thunder Rocks.
Oh, that's a
From
great name. That's a
it,
great name.
yeah. Well, and it's actually sourced from like a native, I think Iroquois name for the area.
Hmm.
And there's a really neat sort of history of why they're called that on the state park sort of like little pamphlet thing. Um, but I looked up why there's not more recent rocks than that there, and I was not able to find anything conclusive.
Wow. So an
So
area of further research.
yeah, and as I said, New York is an incredibly well-studied state, but there are still lots of things where we don't really know the answers to, which I personally find really hopeful as a young aspiring scientist.
Yeah, it's nice to know that like not everything has been found.
Yeah, absolutely. And most people think of like unexplored or unexplained areas as these areas way far off places in like Africa or South America or something. But I'm like, no, there's this neat little state park where it's like, I mean, it's there. People have been going there. Um, obviously, well, if the Native Americans have legends and stories about it, they've been going there for thousands and thousands of years. But like Western science has known about this area for at minimum hundreds of years, and we still don't really know what the deal is with it, which is super cool to me. Right here in New
Yeah.
York State.
The knowing that there is, we have learned a lot and there's still more to go is I don't know, one of the one of the guiding principles of this show, I'd have to think. Um and apparently it's one of the guiding principles of New York State as well, which is kind of nice. Is there anything else we should know about the geology of New York State before we wrap it up here?
Um, let's see. Obviously, this was a very, as with most things on this podcast, a gross oversimplification. Um, but hopefully, it inspires you if you happen to live in New York State to go out and appreciate our really cool, really, really neat, and potentially unexplained geology of New York State because it really is so underrated to anyone who's not from here.
And to anybody who's not from here, there is more to the state than just New York City.
Yes.
And I hope that you got a little bit of that from this episode. And of course, this episode was number 24 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. This has been the episode about New York State. Thank you very much for teaching us all that, Gavin.
Of course, buddy.
And we will see all of you guys next week for episode 25.